Cool.
Hi, everybody. This is Joe Moore, joined by Jack. Today, we're going to do a news roundup. How you doing today, Jack?
I am good, Joe. Glad to be here. Pumped to get into it.
Yeah, same here. I'm just realizing I have a cannabis hat on. I'm going to move that brand over until you guys pay up. So, um, yeah, today, Jack and I decided we're going to do a news show. Kyle and I used to do a news show quite a bit called Solidarity Friday, starting at the beginning of COVID. And it was really popular. You've been doing news for a while. You're an actual journalist with some training and experience, unlike me. And we're going to dig in today. So I'm excited about it. Jack, could you give folks a little bit of an understanding of who you are?
Yeah. So for those who might not be familiar, Jack Gorsline. I'm a investigative reporter and founder of Psychedelic States of America and Psychedelic Writers Guild. So kind of focused primarily on the politics of drug policy reform, having covered both cannabis and psychedelics. In particular, again, that policy focus over the last few years, but have honed in specifically on what I believe, the psychedelic renaissance and that political arm of this movement to be one of the most consequential political movements of the 21st century. So have zeroed in on that. I'm based in Washington, D.C. after kind of getting my start in Boston a few years ago. And yeah, just really fascinated by the way coalition building influences public policy reform in general, and think that the psychedelic renaissance, again, poses some particularly unique challenges in enacting real reform. So,
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And I'm excited to do this with you today. We have a number of things to talk about. We're going to talk about federal policy, state policies in the U.S. We're going to talk about the recent Compass Pathways news, any other kind of big items we'll hit today.
I think that there's a lot of really cool stuff going on at the state level. But what I'm most excited to dig into is breaking down the competing approaches to federal policy reform here in DC, and how that is shaping up in real time. Because I don't think enough folks are aware of how the sausage is made, so to speak.
Until I started spending time in DC, I didn't understand at all. I still barely understand, but I understand a lot better now than I did 4 years ago. So I'm excited to get into that. Cool. Well, let's dig in. Let's start doing the Compass news.
Yeah. So those who might not be familiar, Compass Pathways, probably the largest and largest psychedelic biopharmaceutical company and the closest to FDA approval, released the top line results of their second phase 3 clinical trial earlier this week. Met with a lot of really great fanfare and excitement. I admittedly am not a science journalist by trade, so I defer to Joe on breaking down some of those numbers. But I do think we have an interesting contrarian take to share with you all about the results and what they might mean.
Yeah. Well, so when I was running through a lot of their press, I was in their webinar for a little while, ran through their big press release. The data looks really good. Obviously, they're a publicly traded company, so they have to spin their own data, right? Number go up. They're actually, I saw some action on Twitter today about are we still calling it that? Their stock prices are going
Always.
down despite the positive results, and which is interesting. The positive results I think are substantial, really meaningful. I think they show promise. It's far better than everything else I think we have on the market for treatment-resistant depression. And this is just the first entrant. This is not the last entrant. And this is like, I think the biggest there's a handful of things here, right? So they have Comp 360, which is their proprietary crystalline form of psilocybin, which may or may not hold up. I'm really interested to see how that shakes out in IP court. If anybody ever wants to go for that, I don't think it's really worth anybody's time, but it's interesting to see that a psilocybin molecule in a crystalline form being a different formulation of psilocybin. That's a whole thing. We'll have to find some people to opine on that for us later. But their intervention doesn't necessarily use as much psychotherapy as the overall ecosystem expected. And what that does is drops price quite a bit. the price of the treatment goes down quite a bit. Um, and as a result, people are still getting a lot better, but we wanted to see slightly better numbers than what we saw. I think I saw like 40% remission rates, roughly speaking. I don't have the number offhand, but that's kind of what some of the snark in the space was about, right?
Yeah, yeah, and this idea that psychological support versus psychedelic assisted therapy, there's a pretty
Mhm.
vast gap between the efficacy of the treatment from, at least in some folks' opinions, when you have that minimal intervention, which again, we saw the assisted therapy component uh, be a real sore spot for FDA officials in not
Mhm.
approving Lykos's MDMA assisted therapy novel drug application. Obviously, there's a lot of history there that we won't go into now, but it has been a very clear trend of the companies that are lining up to be potentially first, second approved by the FDA for their psychedelic modalities. We're seeing a move away from the assisted therapy model and trying to call it something different. I'm not so sure that it's not therapy. I just think it's a lot less, and thus fewer billable hours. To your point, Joe.
We should really dig into that just for a moment. Like the difference between psychological support and psychotherapy is substantial, but what is it? Psychotherapy is a licensed profession, really strict rules, different frameworks. Like there's all sorts of different types of psychotherapy. So it's not necessarily the case that it's even uniform across, one therapist to the next. Um,
Mhm.
I think what they did at Compass was kind of really standardized what psychological care was, what psychological support was. Um, and which is interesting from a science perspective because you have like, hey, this is the thing. When you're doing psychotherapy, it's really hard to standardize, in my opinion. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think there's still some really great benefit from psychological support. Zendo Project is psychological support. They have
Sure.
great results. Um, they're able to reduce hospitalizations like crazy, and people are really happy with their results going through that kind of a project.
Yeah. And I think it's a like you said, they're kind of, Compass is kind of setting essentially a new standard for what psychological support really means. And I think that's
Yeah.
incredibly valuable as the pharmaceutical psychedelic field continues to evolve and we end up with some more diverse than just that synthetic psilocybin compound, some more diverse compounds being approved in the future.
Right. And so some statisticians here are talking about how the improvement, the 3.8 point greater improvement on MADRS for 25 milligrams versus 1 milligram at week 6 is significantly statistically significant. But some people are kind of a little lackluster about the results, like being not so far from placebo numbers. It was a pretty big phase 3. I think one site had 258 and the other one had a somewhat similar number. Um, and so it's pretty good. And, you know, um, I don't know, what was your read on some of the doubt on the figures coming from Compass?
I think it's just this idea that there's certainly an upsell on the part of Compass Pathways executives on what these numbers really mean. To your point earlier, Joe, like this is a publicly traded company. They're required to really kind of hype up these results
Mhm.
because it directly benefits, what they're trying to accomplish and their stock price. So the major takeaway that I had from some of those who are a little bit more skeptical isn't that these numbers aren't promising. It's just that the hype surrounding the like you said, the gap, the kind of the distance between placebo numbers and these numbers has been a bit oversold. It also, I don't think, is going to impact Compass Pathways, redundant here, but pathway to FDA approval. I think they're pretty locked in to be approved either by the end of this calendar year, or early 2027. Uh, but it is something that those who might not be as scientifically literate, which isn't anybody's fault. It's the American public education system's fault, if anything. Might not really understand that, yeah, these numbers, while good, to Jim Tate from the Kaikian's report, here's 40% remission for treatment-resistant depression is pretty good. I don't think that there's any pharmaceutical intervention on the market that beats that right now.
To get really
But
specific, they highlighted that 39% of patients on the 25 milligram dose had clinically meaningful reduction. So that's like a certain level of movement on their MADRS score, which is the kind of major metric for depression.
yeah,
So that's pretty great.
pretty impressive. Yeah. And I'm not sitting here and saying that these numbers aren't, worth being excited about. But a dash of nuance and a dose of perspective is certainly helpful as we consider what drugs might come next, what standards they might be held to, and really understanding what Compass Pathways is attempting to accomplish. I feel like it's, we'll get into the policy stuff, and I'm working on some coverage about their influence on state level policy reforms, but Compass Pathways has done a remarkable and, worth noting, 100% legal job of really getting their mission in front of both regulators, but also lawmakers at the state level across the country. I think I saw last week they got a bill introduced, a Breakthrough Therapies Act bill introduced in South Dakota, that as soon as their COMP360 formula is approved by the FDA, South Dakota licensed medical providers will be able to prescribe it to qualifying patients. It is really impressive from a business and regulatory perspective, the way that they have approached this entire process. And I think it's going to be worth keeping in the historical record for how this movement evolves over the next decade.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And, don't forget all the history about Compass. That's always worth revisiting, everybody. There's a long, interesting story there. But I once said, I was at some event in LA, I'm almost a fan of Compass Pathways, and the dirty looks that I got, you know.
Yeah.
I was like, they're gonna win. Like, there's no way they're not gonna get across the finish line. And
Yeah.
it was obvious. And to be first with an actual tryptamine, psychoactive hallucinogenic tryptamine, is pretty cool. Anyway, yeah, we're gonna get into more of that over time, everybody. We're at kind of halfway through our allotted segment. Anything else we want to wrap up with on Compass for right now?
Yeah, I think it's going to be really worth keeping an eye on Catherine Tucker and Shane Pennington's rescheduling petition that's currently working its way through review at HHS. I interviewed Shane, last September, Shane and Catherine, and they pointed out pretty clearly that they view bifurcated scheduling, this idea that crystalline polymorph psilocybin is a completely separate compound from naturally derived psilocybin, as legally dubious, to put it lightly. So Shane even hinted that there could be a legal challenge to such, claim in the near future. So I think it's worth keeping an eye on.
I like that quite a bit, and I think that's a really cool pathway to help get these things into a more appropriate legal status. Yeah, and Kat's point here, yeah, Compass Pathways was a nonprofit. That's why I'm hinting everybody go check out the history. It's quite spicy. Yeah. On to some more federal policies that we got next year.
Yeah. This is something that, having been here in DC for nearly 6 months now, I obviously moved here and got pretty well acquainted with what they call the psychedelics lobby, which, for those who might not know, in DC, amongst congressional staffers interested in this issue, the psychedelics lobby is colloquially known as Psychedelics High School. There's a lot of really cool action going on surrounding federal policy reform efforts and a number of bills that have been introduced over the last couple of years. But as I said at the start of this section, I think it's really important for folks that are interested in how the sausage gets made to understand how exactly that happens. So as far as the competing approaches, there was a bill introduced last December, late last year, called the Freedom to Heal Act. And I recently wrote a pretty solid deep dive for Double Blind Magazine about these competing approaches. The Freedom to Heal Act garnered some pretty significant nonprofit and advocacy support. What the bill would do is essentially codify Schedule One substance access for those trying to, try investigative treatments under the Right to Try Act, signed into law under Donald Trump's first administration back in 2018, I believe. And beyond that, hey, you have a legal right to try Schedule One substances. There isn't really a substantial bureaucratic infrastructure behind what the bill would do. And I think it's notable that competing efforts, I wouldn't say that they're competing, but alternative legislative efforts at the federal level, like the Centers for Excellence Act that was introduced last year, and now most recently, I think it's the Centers for Innovative Therapies Act. I may have butchered the name there, but are really designed to build pretty significant infrastructure both across the VA and a number of other federal agencies, so that increased access to psychedelic therapies, be it in a clinical trial route or through direct treatment at the VA for veterans, is much more streamlined, and data is shared and across all of those agencies. So the big thing that's worth noting in the difference in these bills, I think, is the actual bureaucratic infrastructure proposed, in one versus the other. But I think it's really worth noting the Freedom Deal Act, as I said, has garnered, I think, well over 24 endorsements from pretty prominent advocacy groups across the country. And yet, as I reported for Double Blind Magazine, just a few days after a pretty notable Senate roundtable about psychedelic therapies and psychedelic federal, policy reform, a Senate Veteran Affairs Committee staffer sent an email pretty much noting, like, we're not supporting the Freedom to Heal Act moving forward. This bill, simply put, has not had any legs in Congress since just a few days after it was filed. And yet there's been a pretty significant amount of fundraising. There was, nearly a week-long lobbying day here in DC in early December, and quite a few nonprofit dollars spent to bring people in from all across the country to support a bill that, like, within days of it being filed, just clearly did not have the legs to move any further in Congress. I'm not sitting here and casting moral dispersions on anybody backing one bill or another. That's not the point. This is kind of how DC works. It's a lot of PR before you actually get any motion. But having attended a couple of events at the U.S. Capitol with members of Congress sitting there talking to members of the psychedelic lobby about what it's going to take, there is a growing sense of frustration in this town that certain organizations are more focused on being first in moving federal policy reform efforts forward than they are in doing it as thoroughly and as thoughtfully as possible.
Mhm. Yeah, that's tough, and I think insightful. Like, we really want to make sure we're spending charity dollars appropriately. We're not competing. Why compete here? Like, there's nothing really appropriate to compete about. And we got a comment from somebody really in the know here, Melissa Lavasani: expanding veterans access to emerging treatments, HR 7091, very much worth looking up. Thanks for that, Melissa. And I think we really, just the fragmentation in our ecosystem, I think we really need to find some sort of unity. And especially when we're dealing with this, we have Melissa and Jay Kopelman were just on the podcast. I think it was yesterday, but really we live streamed a week or two ago about the recent DC event that they both kind of coordinated. And this idea of one set of messaging from this ecosystem is really important. We don't have huge biotech dollars here to waste. We have a set finite amount of dollars to spend, and we need to do it strategically and carefully, and people who understand the city. Like, I have been a big fan of Melissa's work for a long time. I think Melissa understands how this city works, and getting behind groups like Psychedelic Medicine Coalition could really be helpful, as opposed to let's spin up yet another 501 with like these new people and go for it. It's like, I think from my time in climate, like I did a little bit of time in climate way back, and coalition building was a really big deal.
Yeah.
And can we do better coalition building and have shared values and alignment? And maybe the visions aren't perfectly aligned, but the long-term vision 20 years out is. So
Yeah.
maybe that works.
Well, and having attended that PMC event that you interviewed Jay and Melissa about, I can tell you that the support is clearly there. There are a bunch of interested
Mhm.
parties, and again, like I sat there and I saw sitting members of Congress saying, "We're here, we're ready to move forward. What is the holdup?" And pretty explicitly saying, "Hey, interested stakeholders who keep coming to us trying to get bills filed and trying to get us to move the ball forward, work together. There's a clear need for it. We don't have really a major cushion to waste. I, in particular, am concerned with a potential backlash against the Maha movement in general. I think it's worth noting that there's been some significant leadership shakeup at HHS recently under RFK Jr. Jim O'Neill, who's been the acting director of the CDC, but is, I believe, deputy secretary of HHS, or was recently exited last week. Jim O'Neill, former president of the Thiel Foundation, who's particularly bullish on longevity science, but also very interested and very supportive of psychedelic research. Actually reported for Double Blind Magazine last year that political insiders here in Washington have long viewed Jim O'Neill as kind of the key to advancing psychedelic policy reform at HHS in particular. Now he's gone. What's next, right? There is ample opportunity to miss the moment and to set us back, set this movement back at the federal level significantly. I don't think that's going to happen because I think there's enough bipartisan support that something will get done. But I do think it's worth keeping an eye on. And for those interested stakeholders, demand more of the organizations you donate your dollars to. That's a really big part of this. Is that if you are an active stakeholder at the lower level of things in your community, be asking more of those who are representing you on Capitol Hill.
Yes, please. Definitely. Cool. So is there anything else? Maybe we can do some state roundup
Yeah,
discussion.
one last thread to keep an eye on at the federal level is at that
Mhm.
PMC event in mid-January here in DC. I was able to ask Congressman Morgan Luttrell from Texas directly if he views the private-public partnership model that has been so effective in Texas and in passing the Texas ibogaine initiative, if he viewed those public-private partnerships as the future of federal policy reform, and he said point blank yes. While hinting that there may be some announcements forthcoming in that particular area. So pharmaceutical companies are going to play an active role in how federal policy reform is developed and enacted. Those of you who might be concerned about that at the grassroots level need to be aware of it so that you can play an active role.
Mhm. Very interesting. Yeah, I have a lot of questions on the model, this public-private partnership thing, like Texas is doing around ibogaine, and we don't have space for that now, but in the future we can dig into that.
Yeah.
So, what's going on in the states? You just had a piece published around Washington.
Yeah. There's a lot. I think Washington State continues to be an interesting climate to keep an eye on, as there is no shortage of support from grassroots activists or state legislators in bringing about some sort of psychedelic policy reform. And yet, just last week, probably the most viable bill, the Washington Medical Psilocybin Act, stalled out before the Ways and Means Committee and was not advanced further by the state's mandatory deadline. I believe it was last Wednesday to vote that bill out of committee and give it a chance at reaching a House and Senate floor vote. Washington State has a pretty remarkable coalition of grassroots advocates. One organization, Reach Washington in particular, I wrote a profile of back in 2024 for Filter magazine. At the time, they were gearing up for what they thought would be a 2026 statewide ballot initiative and had garnered some pretty significant support, but were, as many groups are, looking to fundraise and were having trouble doing that. Notably, their proposed bill and their preferred framework models the Colorado framework enacted under the Natural Medicine Health Act, and very heavy on decriminalization of personal use and home cultivation in particular. That is a hardline priority of theirs and is a big part of why they ended up speaking out against the Washington Medical Psilocybin Act that just fell flat. But around this time last year, Reach Washington was still hoping, maybe we'll be able to get a 2026 ballot initiative off, up and running, start collecting some signatures this year. And very quietly and without any real direct input, a similar version of this, this bill that just died last week was filed last year, by a number of figures with ties to larger national psychedelic advocacy organizations. And I think we continue to see this tension that Washington State highlights as a very solid microcosm of outside organizations, national organizations, bringing in their policy priorities without any real or meaningful consultation with state-level activists who are in these communities and know the temperature of the legislature. And so I personally think that, the work done to raise awareness about some of the inequities that might crop up with advancement of the Washington Medical Psilocybin Act is a testament to actually going to, the State House and speaking your truth. And I think Reach Washington's done a pretty effective job of that and deserves a lot of credit for pushing their lawmakers to not just settle for what passes right now, if the long-term consequences of narrow-minded policy reform are yet unseen down the road.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. The equity conversation is always going to be part of this. And a lot of people want to use this kind of trickle down thing. Like, oh, we experiment with the tech in F1 and then we get it in our Toyota Corolla 20 years later. It's like, it's not really what we're working with here. It's a different conversation.
And it's also not to say that legislation that kind of mirrors a more medicalized version of psychedelic access at the state level, like, for example, in New Mexico, can't be reformed in real time. I think what's happening in New Mexico with the regulatory rollout over the course of this year and possibly into the next, they've set the goal of launching the program by December of this year. It's yet to be seen if they'll actually accomplish that. But the conversations they're having about bringing as much equity into the rollout as possible. We're talking Indigenous practitioners possibly being able to serve as facilitators in these programs, a real concerted effort to scrape up some appropriations funding from the state legislature for an equity and access fund. And that is something that outside organizations with a national footprint like the Healing Advocacy Fund have tried to play an active role in supporting as well, but has really been spearheaded by pushback from local activists and grassroots, advocates across the state who are demanding more. And they have great allies in the state legislature. So there's a way to pass a bill like that and then improve it in real time after it's signed into law. And a lot of, you got to have the right coalition. And it requires direct communication between national stakeholders and local and statewide groups.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Is there a decrim being included in New Mexico?
No.
Okay.
But my understanding is that local deprioritization efforts are going to be ramping up in a number of cities across the state. And there's not a lack of support for decriminalization from lawmakers who are supportive of both the New Mexico Medical Psilocybin Act, but of broader reform beyond it. It just was a compromise that was made that allowed for the New Mexico Medical Psilocybin Act to advance and be signed into law. At the time, decriminalization through the state legislature was just not viable with the Republican allies that they had. And I think you'll continue to see that. But I think that there's a way for a bill like the New Mexico Medical Psilocybin Act to be refined enough where widespread decriminalization is viable in the near future.
And in my home state of New Hampshire, there's a recent bipartisan bill to legalize the regulated use of psilocybin for medical purposes. And that was the House of Reps approved that. And we'll see where that goes. I don't know how much support it has. Hopeful. New Hampshire still does not yet have legal cannabis. I think medical maybe, but recreational not. So interesting from the live free or die state. Anyway, I think it's cool. I know some people involved in this, and I'm hopeful that they'll get really good insight and some good guidance.
New Hampshire's been trying for a number of years. I give them a lot of credit as that conservative jewel of New England, that they have been pushing the envelope with what legalized access to psilocybin might look like in a way that isn't strictly medical. And I think we could see inspired similar efforts in states like Maine and Vermont. Vermont just filed an interesting ibogaine bill as well that I'll be writing about in the near future.
Yeah. And people were asking about any updates from the recent Ambio death, and there's been nothing there to share. We did have some commentary on safety in our recent podcast with Jay Kopelman and Melissa Lavasani. How can we have some sort of unified framework? I kind of also wrote about this recently on the Psychedelics Today article section. Yeah. So, we're getting some comments here from a public health perspective. There's money to be saved via decrim. Yeah, both from public health, criminal justice, and if you read Carl Hart, there's multi-generational value
Yeah.
in things like decrim. So please read Carl Hart. Yeah, no real actual profit, but yeah, I think it's always worth evaluating. We could do a deep dive on this in the future, Jack, but I'm always more around repealing the Controlled Substances Act than drug by drug decriminalization. And I think,
Yeah.
um, I think, yes, I appreciate decrim. I just don't think it goes anywhere close to far enough. If we're talking psychedelic decrim only, there's so many things we need to help fix here.
Yeah. And Viva la Underground. There's certainly a lot
That's it.
of incredible practitioners and scientists and those who are still actively working the underground who deserve immense credit for the cultural renaissance we're witnessing. And yet, I agree with you, Joe, that I'm not quite sure that blanket decriminalization is the answer alone.
Yeah. Yeah, it just can't go far enough. And yeah, anyway, we can get into more of that later. Anything else before we wrap here? Any other hot news bits?
I will say I can't speak much on the recent death at Ambio, but I am aware that some news coverage could be forthcoming. And I also think folks should really take the time to look into the recent happenings at Transcend Wellness in Cancun. It's not my place to speak on, but accountability for some of these clinics working south of the border could be a very useful thing in legitimizing both the science and the integration of said science into Western medical healthcare systems.
Right. Yeah. And Kat here putting some stuff up about Louisiana. Absolutely. There is some action in Louisiana. It's very, very interesting. It's got a flavor that when I watch the video coming out of Louisiana, I'm just like, oh, that's a different spin on the psychedelic
My,
movement. I'm like pretty psyched on it.
yeah, and my understanding is that there'd been a psilocybin task force in Louisiana that has essentially kind of been abandoned to go all in on ibogaine, which I think is a sign of the significant conservative support for ibogaine comparative to other psychedelics. Not that there isn't conservative support for other psychedelics, but nothing quite gets Southern Republicans supportive of healing veterans as riled up as ibogaine does. Tennessee and Oklahoma have also introduced ibogaine bills. And a very last thread that I want people to keep an eye on is that there is private prison industry money, from my understanding, that is supportive of state level ibogaine reform in Tennessee. I don't know much more than
Tennessee,
that right
interesting.
now, but I know that there are some interesting conversations being had with some folks that might have ties to some private prison industry revenue streams.
All right. That's ripe for commentary next time.
Yeah,
All right.
sure.
Well, Jack, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. Thank you all out there for tuning in. And we're hoping to do this more often, everybody. So stay tuned. Thank you, Jack from Psychedelic States of America. Thank you all. And we'll see you next time.
Alrighty, Thanks, Joe.